me to begin by saying thank you to our amazing tech team. It does take a village, and we have some amazing volunteers in our village. Things have been going okay today so far, but we're doing a shakedown cruise for the next few weeks before we open for business, so that everyone can come back into our building, we're hoping. Also, I do want to say, a very special birthday shout out to Kay Abbott, 100 years old today. Happy birthday. Well, I'm going to be working from my cell phone today, so I hope I can read that, but we'll see. Our theme for June is play, and play in its many different manifestations. Today, I want to talk about the rules of games. I want to consider the concept of games in a wide context. Mostly, I want to examine how not knowing the rules of the game can be debilitating. First, take a light example. It's getting warm here in Minnesota, and the other afternoon, my wife Teresa and I were out for a walk. Teresa mentioned that in many cultures, carrying a parasol to block UV rays is common and accepted. Here in the US, it's eccentric and a little weird. Now, where did that rule come from? The word itself says what a parasol is actually for. Para is against, and sol is sun. Parasols are about keeping out the sun, not the rain. But what about umbrella? Umbra is Latin for shadow. Ella is a diminutive, and umbrella is a little shadow, which is not something you need to carry around in the rain. But there you go, when the sun is very intense. Where did that rule in US culture come from? How come carrying around a little shade is quaint and eccentric? Rules, they're always there in human relations and human societies. Sometimes we know about them, and sometimes we don't. So, a personal example. I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian household. That meant a whole litany of things, including, for one, playing cards was not allowed in our house. Of the devil, my family said. As a matter of fact, playing cards were called the devil's picture book. So I wasn't allowed to play cards when I was a kid, and consequently, when I went away to college, I didn't know any rules of any card games. Well, just learn, right? But do you realize how many card games there are when you don't know any and have never even seen cards before? I struggled to learn the rules of card games with my new friends. What's a suit? What's a ace? What's it mean to have jokers wild? I was clueless about all of those things. Well, Rev Jim read this morning from Susanna Crossman in the welcome, saying, for group play to function, everyone must feel safe to play. Now, social rules are often unstated, and that's where the unsafety comes from. Often even unnoticed go the rules by people who enforce them or by those who are accidentally breaking them. As someone who comes from a culture of poor farmers, I learned almost subconsciously that I needed to watch the unspoken rules of the American middle class very carefully because we didn't know those rules. It is the little things. In my culture, for example, people don't look each other in the eye. That's considered aggressive. We even have this American phrase, I looked him straight in the eye. It's about aggression, right? And we just don't do that in my hillbilly culture. A big challenge for me has always been the American middle class propensity to express confidence no matter what. Where I come from, it's considered prideful to say you're good at something. For example, if someone says, "Hey, I hear you're a master chef," the right answer is, "Oh, yeah, I can cook a little." The majority culture makes fun of that propensity by calling it the aw shucks attitude. Aw shucks, that ain't good. Well, aw shucks is not something we say in the Ozarks. I've never heard anybody say that in the Ozarks. It's a way of denigrating people who shuck corn because we don't know the rules of the game. The rules of one culture jar up against the rules of another culture. And where I come from, if you express great confidence, as in, "Well, I would never do that," the answer is, "You're born, but you ain't dead." Meaning, it is the height of pridefulness to assume what you would do given certain circumstances. You might do just about anything because, after all, you're born, but you ain't dead. Now, given the fact that 85% of Americans lie on their resumes, where does that leave people from the cultures like mine? In other words, unspoken social rules among dominant social groups make people feel like outsiders, and unspoken social rules make people in dominant groups outsiders somehow. I just don't get the rules of this game. If I come into a job interview and don't look you in the eye and don't express confidence that I can do the job, am I going to get the job? Okay, here's another example. Candidates going into Unitarian Universalist ministry have to get a psychological evaluation. Now, not just any psychological evaluation, but a particular one. So everything is standardized. I noticed as I took the test that several of the questions had to do with hearing voices, the voice of God, the voices of the dead. Where I come from, expressing things as if God is speaking is very, very common. We don't use the word God because that's considered it's kind of very dangerous to say, but we'll say something like, "Well, I was just standing there and the good Lord told me," or something like that. Or you can talk about the dead like that. "I heard my mama, Lord bless her soul," which also means she's dead, Lord bless her soul. "I heard my mama just as plain as day saying, 'Don't you do that now.'" It's just a way that we express ourselves. Well, when I took that psychological evaluation, I knew the proper white middle class answer to the questions. You're not supposed to hear God or the dead speaking. So I got those questions right, but they are unspoken rules. Unitarian Universalists express great dismay at why people of different groups don't want to be Unitarian Universalists. I suspect the answer is far more about those unspoken rules than it is about any kind of the beliefs that we have. Many people visit Unitarian Universalist congregations and realize fairly quickly that they don't know the rules of the game. They aren't part of the group. I'm just talking about my own personal experience here. You may have had some of those experiences. As someone who came into the Unitarian Universalist fold from the working class, I just had to adjust. For example, among UUs, sharing your feelings is one of those big deals. You're supposed to share your feelings. Let's all be honest with each other. But here's the thing. There are rules to the game of sharing your feelings. You can only share certain kinds of feelings, and you have to say some feelings and not other feelings. And I learned very early on in my UU experience that my reactions, my natural reactions, weren't acceptable. Why are you laughing at that? That's not funny. Why are you smiling at that? There's nothing to smile about. Well, we hillbillies are very cynical people. We don't think anything is ever going to go right. We have a very dark sense of humor. So our natural reactions are wrong. Oh, well, what do you do when you're in that place? Well, you don't say, hey, my cultural norms just don't agree with yours. No, you don't. You don't do that. Or I don't anyway. What I do is disassociate and I withdraw. And I say that I don't like sharing my feelings. I'm not withdrawing from sharing feelings. However, I am withdrawing from those unspoken rules that say what I can and can't say, that say my feelings are wrong. Now, I'm saying all this not to be saying, oh, poor, pitiful me. I'm just pointing out that, hey, I'm a Euro-American heterosexual male, so I can fairly easily fit into the dominant culture of Unitarian Universalism. It doesn't take all that much adjustment for me to disappear into the woodwork. After all, I got an education eventually, and I got a professional job, and I can express myself fairly well. But think about people who can't for all kinds of different reasons, people who can't disappear into the white woodwork of Unitarian Universalism. I'm very good at saying, just pretend I'm not here. That's a very hillbilly way of doing it. But some people see that as hypocrisy and can't allow themselves to do that and live up to those rules of the game. Now, I know that each of us have our own rules. There are subjective rules that we live by, but there are also the rules that we learn according to our social locations. And then when we find ourselves in various spaces, we naturally adjust those. But we have to remember, I think, that there are invisible rules, and we do need to be very careful about how we express the rules of the game to those who maybe don't understand. Again, I was lucky. W.E.B. Du Bois coined the term double consciousness to describe the experience of African Americans in white spaces. Du Bois pointed out that African Americans experience this challenge as they process the knowledge that Euro-Americans are judging them all the time and finding their expectations not met and therefore judging people. And so it's a double mirror going back and forth, back and forth. Now, again, I was lucky. Despite my social class, I could disappear into that dominant white culture. But that's not what we want of Unitarian Universalism. A very old discussion in Unitarian circles has been the question of whether or not the movement could go beyond the neighborhood of Boston, as we used to say. This is still a question, and perhaps it's the question of Unitarian Universalism, because the neighborhood of Boston is not a geographical space anymore. It is a mental space, because, Boston nowadays is a multicultural city. But the Boston that Unitarianism comes from was not a multicultural city. The rules of that Boston Unitarianism set a very high standard on education, professional achievement, public service, etiquette, a disinterested debate, intellectualized discussions, self-confident individuality, what used to be called refinements and culture, which all were code words for very Euro-American, very white WASP. Now, humanism has unfortunately now taken on many of the trappings of that Boston neighborhood. Many of the rules of the Unitarian Universalist game have entered into humanism. But we do need to remind ourselves that humanism is not from the neighborhood of Boston, but from the Midwest. Actually, humanism was immediately and viciously opposed by the East Coast Unitarian elite, what at that time was called the humanist controversy. Well, it wasn't a controversy for the humanists. It was a controversy for the Unitarians who had their theology degrees from Harvard. What were a couple of Midwesterners, John Dietrich and Curtis Reese, doing wading into liberal theology when everybody knew that you had to be from the neighborhood of Boston and have a Harvard degree in order to do that? After all, Reese and Dietrich had started out as ministers in outre religions. Dietrich was from Minneapolis, Reese was from Des Moines. These were places with new immigrants, Scandinavians, Germans. They just weren't up to that WASP level of the neighborhood of Boston, the Brahmins, the Blue Bloods, the Beacon Hill place where the Unitarian headquarters sat. Questioning the Christian tradition and the Protestant God of the Unitarians and the Universalists, which they saw, I think, as being the backbone of America, maybe. Well, that was just against the rules. Saying that pedestrian, plodding, workmanlike science explained more than those high soaring theologies from Harvard just wasn't acceptable. It was breaking the rules. Roasting sacred cows is not an activity for the well-bred in the neighborhood of Boston, after all. I think humanists do well to remember our roots, and I, for one, would never have become a Unitarian Universalist if it hadn't been for that humanist strain, because the Boston God didn't make any more sense to me than my Ohio River Valley God that I grew up with. But wait a minute, okay? I think you're probably seeing a contradiction at this place because reflect for a moment that I've been talking about how we human beings create and conform to rules that then exclude people. But isn't that a paradox? Because one of the main things we human beings want is to be together, isn't it? I think that's the starkest thing that we learned in the pandemic is people like being together, and actually we suffer when we're not. So why do we set up these rules for each other and against each other, exclusion and inclusion? Well, unfortunately, we create both ways to be together and ways to be apart. But what's up with that? In many ways, we so desperately want to be with other human beings, yet somehow we want them to be just like us. We want people who understand us, talk like us, think like us. Well, that's maybe good for a softball team or a bowling league, but it's not good for a congregation. That's not our purpose. Last week I was answering questions about FUS and how we really want diversity. We even have a Moving Towards Equity team tasked with helping us find ways to be more open and diverse. It's one of our main aspirations. We really strive for that. And one way we can get there is by calling out our own unstated rules. That's what a culture is, after all. It's a set of rules, many of which are unstated. As an old Midwestern farmer, allow me to close by saying what I think is the most damaging of Unitarian Universalist rules of the game. And actually, I think it goes right back to those Puritans in the neighborhood of Boston. It's the propensity to confess to being the greatest of sinners and then asserting that somehow miraculously I am hugely forgiven, and therefore the greatest of sinners has now become the most redeemed of sinners, and therefore I used to be wrong, but guess what? Now I am so very, very right all the time. Now, I still think like a Pentecostal, and our view is that goes back to that old saying, you're born, but you ain't dead. Those mistakes just keep on coming as human beings. We don't get to some kind of plateau in which we are saved from ourselves and suddenly become all knowing. We need to remember that, I'm not the greatest sinner. I'm just kind of a mundane sinner, I think. I invite us all, as a matter of fact, to forget about that sin and forgiveness thing. We only need, I believe, the grace and the gumption to keep on trying, failing, and then trying again and failing better. So may it be.